Welcome to Taiwan Talk. I'm your host, Alex Lewis. On the show this week, we speak to Taipei Times reporter Cheung about his weekly article, Taiwan in Time. Taiwan in Time is a column about Taiwan's history that is published every Sunday, and it spotlights important or interesting events around the nation that have anniversaries that week. You may be familiar with his articles on the Taipei Times, or you may have heard him on this podcast before with my predecessor, Keith Menconi. But let's get to know Han a little bit better anyway before we delve into Taiwan in Time.
So I'm a features reporter for the Taipei Times. So we're all encouraged to come up with a column. And since I was doing history when I was editor for a small town paper in Wyoming, so I decided to keep doing that. And so I had a book in Wyoming that came out based on the small town history. So it just started really randomly. We were like, come up with a column. I'm like, oh, I'll do history because I'm friends with the people at the museum and they can help me out. And then it kind of turned into my specialty with the book coming out. And then when I came back to Taiwan, I really didn't think that much. I was just like, I'll just keep doing it. And then I realized how history in Taiwan it's really different from Wyoming because, like silence and like a lot of people don't know about a lot of important events that happened. I thought it was just because, I haven't lived in Taiwan for the past 15 years, so I don't know about this stuff, but I was talking to my Taiwanese friends, and they didn't know about a lot of the stuff I was looking at. So that put, like, a whole new, like, mission and perspective to my work. So I've been actually writing this column, plan on it being a one-year thing, but it's over 3 years now, and I'm still finding interesting things to write about. So,
wow. And you pick a day in time.
Yeah. Because since it's a weekly, it comes out every Sunday, so I just write about things that happen that week. So if it comes out on a Sunday, it'll be about things that happen next Monday to the next Sunday.
I see.
And there is just so much to write about.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And it is my understanding that you're coming out with a book as well, right?
Yeah, because there really isn't a comprehensive English Taiwanese history that's kind of like popular reading. Like most of the stuff is academic. So I'm trying to come up with something that's fun and easy to read and gives foreigners like a quick, general, but like enjoyable understanding of Taiwanese history.
Okay, that's really cool. When is that going to come out? When does that due? Is it still fluid? Or?
Yeah, it's still kind of fluid. So
okay.
Like maybe in the near future, let's say like next year or so.
Okay. So we welcome Han on the show to talk about the 4 articles that he wrote for the month of August. A couple of the articles were very timely in nature, and we'll start with one such piece titled Deadly Waters and Their Legends. So this piece covers August 6th to August 12th in history and talks about the floods that occurred in 1898 and 1959 that caused widespread destruction, mostly to the country's central and southern areas. This is timely because Taiwan just went through torrential rains in central and southern Taiwan during August. The rains wreaked havoc, but tales of destruction during heavy rains and flooding are commonplace. They kind of go hand in hand. So instead, Han focused on the peripheral stories and uncovered some intriguing folklore. So what was like your biggest takeaway from writing this piece?
So I didn't want to focus that much on death and destruction. So I kind of looked at the interesting things, and I found that the first 2 floods actually had some legends tied to it. So it's like the myths that come out of, destruction. Or maybe it's not a myth because some people get mad at me if I said that because the people who propagated the myth still maintain that it's true. So basically there was one account that, the Taiwanese night market snack of bawan was created because of the flood. And because like all the firewood, everything was like drenched, so they couldn't really cook. And it happened to be Ghost Month, so they used to like make these glutinous rice balls to like worship appease the hungry ghosts and things like that, and they couldn't do any of that. So actually, this guy, he was like a spirit medium for this temple, and the deity possessed him and gave him a recipe to create this kind of like pastry thing that could be easily made. And they actually made that and then started like using that to, like perform rituals and feed the hungry. And then that recipe kept being, like refined and until it's the bawan we know of today. And this guy's great grandson still runs a bawan shop in Zhanghua, and he is the one who maintains that the story is true, and the newspapers still report on that every now and then.
And is that normal for you to do when it comes to writing a Taiwan in time piece? Do you want to look for something that's out of the ordinary or off the beaten path?
Yeah, it depends on what I find. Like, I go into it just wanting to write about the floods, but so I actually had to rewrite this piece because I found out about the bawan and the other legends that came out from the other flood, and then I was like, whoa, actually there's this element to it that I had no idea. So it's a learning process for me too. And but sometimes my whole story can change. So in the middle I had to restructure the whole thing because of my new discoveries.
For the week of August 13th to August 19th, Han wrote a piece titled Fractured Resistance. The piece covers the flourishing of Taiwanese culture and political activism in the 1920s against Japan, and then the subsequent factionalism that led to several ugly splits. The fault lines in the resistance were mainly created by ideological differences. The leaders of the resistance were mostly wealthy intellectuals. When less well-heeled compatriots began espousing Marxist maxims that ran counter to their ideals, or self-interest at least, their united front collapsed.
The next one was about fractured resistance. So it's basically about the Taiwanese kind of anti-Japanese resistance in the 1920s. This was passive resistance. The violent resistance had all been stamped out by like the 1915 or somewhere around there. As far as the Han Chinese population, the Aboriginals were still resisting, but basically they had turned to like cultural resistance. So it's like gaining autonomy, promoting like a Taiwanese consciousness, and basically they wanted a Taiwanese assembly and like a self-rule, and they actually went to Japan, to Tokyo, and like petitioned like multiple times. So they gave up fighting, but they still wanted self-rule and like things like that. And these were all like pretty wealthy intellectuals that were doing this. And but they just couldn't really cooperate. So they had a whole history of like arguing and then splitting and then arguing and splitting. And the big part of it was a lot of them studied in Japan, and like Marxism and leftist ideals were a big thing there. So that led to like a lot of like disagreements between the people and the activists, because most of the leaders were actually wealthy intellectuals, and that was what leftism is like
not really going for.
Not really going for. So that led to a lot of splits. So my article just describes like how, they formed the Taiwan People's Party, but then that split, and then that kept splitting, and
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, because some people, the rich people, just wanted to focus solely on getting self-governmentship, but the other, like Jiang Weishui, he's like a really, probably the father of like, like Taiwanese nationalism, but he was really big on like, workers' rights, farmers' rights, and things like that, and they wanted, but class struggle would have and did like break apart these parties, and then eventually they all got stamped out. And ironically, the Japanese government actually went after communists first, so all the leftist ones got stamped out. And then there was only one party left in the end, the Taiwan Local Autonomy Alliance, and they managed to survive just because they were not leftist. But then after Japan like launched their full-scale invasion of China, they were like, okay, things are probably like, we're probably not going to get what we want, and it's probably dangerous to continue, and so they disbanded themselves, and that was the end of it. And then World War II began, so there was no more room for such activities, really.
Let's proceed to August 20th to August 26th. In the piece titled A Dark Day for Taiwanese Diplomacy, Han gives light to the story of Taiwan being banned from the 1962 Asian Games hosted in Indonesia, and Taiwan's severance of official diplomatic ties with South Korea in 1992, both events happening on August 24th. Both of these issues are still relevant and, you could say, ongoing today. Let's take a look at the current state of sports from an international perspective. Taiwan lost its rights to host the East Asian Games. Citizens of Taiwan are pushing for a referendum to participate in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics under the name Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei. And on a good note, Taiwan participated in the 2018 Asian Games that were held in Indonesia 56 years after Taiwan was banned. Comes full circle. And looking at Taiwan's diplomatic relations, the island is down to 17 allies after the severance of ties with El Salvador.
And then the second part of this article was talking about in 1992, the breaking of ties with longtime ally South Korea.
Yeah. So August 24th, we lost Korea. And that's also relevant because we're losing allies at an alarming rate.
Yeah, we're down to 17 right now.
Yeah, but back then, it was interesting because I was looking at, there was this book by Rick Chu about called 再见阿里郎, like Goodbye Arilang. So it was just talking about Taiwan-Korean relations and how the whole thing happened. And he was kind of saying, he was asking the same questions. He was like, what happens if we lose all our allies? And that book was published in 1993. And we're still asking the same questions now. And the government just announced last week that it has a zero ally plan, but we don't know what it is. So we're still asking the same questions we did like 30-something years ago. And what was also interesting was like how mad people were back then. And now it's just like a matter of fact kind of thing. Like people were like burning the Korean flag and like surrounding the Korean embassy. They did that when like the U.S. broke ties with Taiwan, but like, yeah, now it just seems like, oh no. Like,
yeah, sort of like acceptance of fate, it seems.
It kind of is. And it's kind of like South Korea just like suddenly breaking ties. And it was like a really important allies. The two were brothers in arms, like because it was Taiwan and China, and then it was like South Korea and North Korea.
Right.
And they were like the two part of the Asian Tigers. So they enjoyed like really strong ties. And so it came as more of a shock. And then these like little countries leaving, for China.
Yeah.
Han's last article for August looked at August 27th through September 2nd. The piece is titled The Puppet Master Heads West, a piece about Li Tianlu.
This is actually my second article on puppetry. The first one was about Huang Haidai.
Just couldn't get enough.
But basically Li Tianlu and Huang Haidai are the two, like main puppet masters. So this guy, I focused on this guy because it was really interesting because he likes to say his life began after he turned 70. And this is from a guy who had been performing since he was 8 years old and traveling. And then he suffered through, like the Japanese band, everything Taiwanese. So he had to perform Japanese puppet shows for a while. And then it kind of went up and down. He like flourished after the KMT came. And then it's just in the 70s, people just started losing interest in the traditional arts. And so he was planning on retiring. He turned 68. And by this time, he had only been to China and Hong Kong. And he doesn't count China as leaving the country because it was 1947 and the KMT ruled both Taiwan and China. So anyways, so he considered, like, he left the country for the first time to perform in Hong Kong when he was 68 years old. And he came back. He was like, I'm going to retire. And then suddenly this... He likes to say, like, one Frenchman turned it all around. So basically, this French scholar who was teaching French in Hong Kong, he developed this really intense interest in, like, puppetry. And he came to Taiwan to do field work, and he chose Li Tianlu because he had kind of stayed true to the traditional art form, while the other ones were, like, experimenting with pop music and, like, special effects and, like, things like that. And they really hit it off. And the guy was like, well, can I send some of my students to study with you? And he's like, sure. So then when the next year, like, 3 French people came from Paris to study with him. And through word of mouth, he started taking on more and more foreign students. And that was interesting because, like, people actually criticized him. They were like, why are you teaching these foreigners? He's like, well, the Taiwanese don't want to learn. They're not interested in this anymore, so I'll teach who wants to learn. And
that was actually a really interesting part of the article for me, like reading about how people in Taiwan really didn't care until it came back around, right? So he started from him, went to France or Europe, and then came back to China.
Yeah.
And then once it came back to China, like people in Taiwan really took note about puppetry and about Li Jianlu.
Yeah. So he was a stubborn man. He went ahead with his plans and retired anyways, but he kept teaching these foreigners, and they actually went back to Paris and formed their own puppet troupe. And then they started touring. They actually toured China. So, and these things were no longer so like a lot of Chinese culture is actually preserved better in Taiwan because we didn't go through the Cultural Revolution. So basically, the French puppet troupe visited Quanzhou, where a lot of that's in Fujian, where a lot of the Taiwanese originally immigrated from, like 300 or 400 years ago.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of cultural similarities, and so they were performing there, and then this guy recognized a puppet that they were using, which had been given to the French guys by Li Tianlu, and Li Tianlu didn't really know where it came from, but that guy was like, my father made that. And that guy was a really old man by then, and he was like, had tears in his eyes, and then that attracted all the reporters. It's like, French people bringing this puppet from Taiwan back to China, and then found a connection. And these people had lost all of their puppets due to the Cultural Revolution, so they were so moved to see that. And then their next stop after China was Taiwan, so this became like national news. So it was like, well, these Li Tianlu taught these French people who formed their own troupe in Paris and then brought puppetry back to China, and then found that their lost art was preserved in Taiwan. So it became a really amazing story. And then at this point, like, Taiwanese interest in like puppetry really, it kind of revived. It didn't really take off again, but like Li Tianlu says in his memoir that it gave puppetry a second life. So,
yeah, it really sounds like it. And it's like so cool. It's just like just chance happened. Like, a chance meeting with this Frenchman, and then a chance meeting with this one guy that recognized his father's puppet.
Right, and of all the places in China they could have gone to, they went to that one village in Quanzhou.
And that happened, yeah. And actually, I looked it up. France has a history of puppetry. They love puppetry, and they have like puppets and stuff just all around, I guess, France. I wouldn't say all around, but, like they're like puppet like stations and stuff, and they still have puppet shows and everything. It's really interesting that these two countries, France and Taiwan, didn't really collaborate other than like through cultural means, right? Like through puppetry.
Yeah. That was really interesting connection, and then that kind of led to like Li Tianlu's like lifetime connection with France. Like before he died, he visited like 7 or 8 times, and he actually started touring the world after that, because like the first time he retired, his students just invited him to go chill in France. So he did that for a month. He put on some like private performances, but that actually got the attention of the French Ministry of Culture. So they started inviting him every year to go teach workshops there. And that turned into this huge, he just started this really big international demand for this guy. So he went to the U.S., he went to Morocco, Italy, South Korea, Japan, like everywhere. So the last 20 years of his life was touring the world, basically. So that's why he says his life didn't begin until he turned 70. And a portion of his ashes are buried in France. So it kind of became his like permanent second home.
A big thank you to Han for meeting me for the interview. If you'd like to read his articles, you can find them on the Taipei Times website. Just search for Taiwan in Time. Always interesting and always informative. And that's this week's edition of Taiwan Talk. Please check out our past episodes on the ICRT website or on iTunes, or you can just Google Taiwan Talk. And if you want a podcast about local current events, check out Taiwan This Week. That happens every Friday. Thanks for listening. I'm Alex Lewis.
Thank you.